One of the most important skills in knitting is being able to read your knitting. What that means is that you're able to tell what it is your knitting is telling you. So how many rows, how many stitches, what stitch did you work last, and those kinds of things. We're going to start with reading some stocking stitch. The first thing to note is what stitches actually look like. So your stitches are knit in rows and columns. So we'll go down from one of the stitches and you'll see that below that there are a series of V's. And these V shapes are what we think of as stitches. So each of those is a stitch. And you can see that you have a side stitch, and then you can count all the stitches across your work. So you can tell how many columns of stitches you have. It's really useful to be able to tell that, because if you need to go back in a piece of work and tell where you increased or decreased, you'll know your stitch counts before and after. You also need to know how to identify your stitches because you want to be able to count the number of rows that you have worked. So not only does one V represent one column, it also represents one row of stitches. So if I start at my cast off edge and I count my V's, I have 8 V's, which means that I have worked 8 rows of this pattern. It's a really useful skill to be able to tell how many rows you've done, particularly when you're using a pattern that tells you to knit X amount of rows and you forget to mark where you're going to start. There are times when you might find yourself in a little bit of doubt as to whether or not your cast off is counting or not. One way to tell is where you cast on. So in this case, I know I cast on using a regular knit cast on, which means that I started my first row on the right hand side of the piece, which means my yarn would have been on the right. I now know that I have worked an even number of rows because my yarn is still on the right. So I must have knit one row across and then a second row back. And that's useful if you have a point where you're not sure whether you have 7 rows or 8 rows. It'll tell you whether you should have an even or an uneven number of rows. I find it easier sometimes to count the backs of my stitches. So if we look at my stitches from the front, the little V actually loops up around the stitch above it. And you'll know that from making the stitches. And those little bumps appear at the back of the work. So those bumps also represent a stitch. And each ridge is a row, which makes it easier sometimes to count your work from the back, which is where I most often count mine from. So I have my cast on, and then I have 8 sets of bumps. And that's another way of counting your stocking stitch rows. The next reason it's really important to be able to read your knitting is when you're identifying what we call selvage stitches, and they're the first and last stitches of your work in many projects, not all but many. And what you're trying to do here is identify the ladders between your first column of stitches, your selvage, and your next column. You will need to do this when you are learning how to seam your garments using mattress stitch or any other type of stitch that you would assemble a garment with. Again, we cover that in finishing school as the next steps for this. Another reason that it's important to know how to read your knitting, but also to understand how your stitches are constructed, is when you're doing repairs. We will have a full section on repairs, but I'm just going to show you what I mean now. So I come to this stitch and it unravels all the way to the bottom. Knowing how many rows I need to have and how I fix that stitch and pick it up is really important. So I know that I have 5 bands of yarn that need to be turned back into stitches in this column. It's also really reassuring, I think, to see this, that if you drop one stitch, it is just a column of stitches that you are repairing. In this case, I know these are knit stitches, so I know that I need to bring my loop up through them in a particular way. We will look at this in more detail later on, but I'm just going to show you why reading your knitting is important in this case. So I've picked up my stitch and breathed a sigh of relief. But have I picked up all of my stitches? And we'll look at that right now. Once I pick up my stitch, I go back and I look at it to make sure that it's okay, but it's not. and you'll see that I actually have one stitch loop that's too big. So on either side of it there are two V's, but it's only one V. And when I turn it around I see why. I've missed one of my stitches at the back of the work. So being able to read your knitting is a really good way of telling if you have repaired something correctly as well. So you can see where you may have missed a stitch or where you've dropped a stitch and all of those things, which are really useful. We'll definitely be doing a lot more of that in Learn to Knit. So in the same way that you can read stocking stitch, you can also read garter stitch. I find garter stitch a little bit trickier because of the way it's constructed, but it's still very easy to tell where you are. So garter stitch is done in sets of ridges. So when you count your ridges, you know that you have 2 rows for each ridge. And I normally count my garter stitch from the back because I've completed the rows. I do it when I've completed an even number of rows. So let's pull out the garter stitch here and see how it's structured compared to stocking stitch. So with garter stitch, because we were putting the bumps to one side on one row and the other side on the other row, there are a series of stitches and bumps. So you can see that you have a bump and a stitch and a bump and a stitch, like a little V and then a not a V, which is the case with garter stitch. So it's a little bit trickier to read, but it is there as well for you in the information. And again, you'll see here over to the side that you have a selvage stitch there as well. You also see that each bump is a stitch, so it's easier to see those when you look closely at garter stitch. So each top of the stitch counts, but not the bottom. The bottoms of those bumps is what connects the stitches together. It is just as important to be able to identify your selvage stitches in garter stitch. They're ever so slightly different to stocking stitch. So they're along the side between your columns of stitches, but one is to the back and one is to the front, which is slightly different. And again, that is because of how the stitches are formed in garter stitch. Also in the same way as stocking stitch, being able to read your knitting in garter stitch is super important for repairs. And again, if we watch this being pulled out, it is different when you would pull it out for stocking stitch, because your yarn goes back and then forward, back and then forward. So that is something else that's really useful, in that you see the construction of the stitches is different. So when you're picking that stitch up, you will have to pick it up in 2 different ways. You'll have to put one thread through one way and then the other thread through another. And again, that's something that's really useful to be able to tell when you're knitting. As we look at more and more and different stitch types, we'll cover how to read those as well.